One of these trees once made up a quarter of the forest from Maine to Georgia, almost 4 billion of them. Then, a fungus showed up at the Bronx Zoo in 1904 and wiped out nearly all of them in 40 years. Another was secretly grafted by an enslaved man in Louisiana in 1846, and that one trick built the whole pecan industry. These are 12 native nut trees you can plant once and harvest forever, but half of them are quietly disappearing right now.
So why should you eat chestnuts? Chestnuts are low in calories and they're very low carb food, high in protein. Chestnuts are loaded with magnesium and potassium. They help lower your blood sugar. They're good for your digestion.
Let's start way down at number 12, the Allegheny chinquapin. Think of it as the American chestnut's smaller, scrappier cousin. It grows wild from Massachusetts down through Florida and west into Texas, usually as a shrubby little tree, and drops a sweet brown nut about half the size of a real chestnut. People have eaten it so long that its name comes straight from the Powhatan language, chinquapin. But the part that actually matters is what happened during the Great Chestnut Blight, the tree-killing fungus that wiped out nearly every American chestnut. The chinquapin took that same hit and kept going. It still gets sick, sure, but instead of just dying, it keeps throwing up fresh shoots that make nuts all over again. So while the chestnut itself crashed, its little cousin quietly walked away from the same plague. Stick one in your yard, and it'll hand you a sweet crop every year off a tree that already beat the thing that killed billions. However, if you'd rather grow a nut the size of your thumb than your fingernail, hang on, because the biggest one in the whole family is coming up. Now climb up to number 11, the Shellbark hickory. Growers nicknamed it the king nut, and once you see one, you get why. The shellbark drops the biggest nut of any hickory in North America, some of them around 2.5 inches long, with a taste people compare to a sweeter, fruitier pecan. It's the bigger, slower cousin of the shagbark, and it handles cold way better than a pecan does, so it's one of the best nut trees you can plant up north. So why have you never seen one in a store? It got hammered by overpicking. It's a pain to move because of one giant root, and it barely grows outside the yards of nut nerds who hunt these trees down. But a grafted shellbark can pump out huge, easy cracking nuts for over 100 years. That's a 100-year grocery store almost nobody knows about. But that nut fed something way bigger than any human ever could. Try the most common bird in all of North America, a whole species that's now completely gone. Sitting at number 10, the American beech.
American beech is one of our shade-tolerant trees found in our forest, so we'll oftentimes find seedlings growing in the understory, but also large trees reaching into the canopy. American beech has alternate leaf arrangement, simple leaves, and the leaves have a very distinctive pattern of having the veins running parallel out to small teeth on the edge of the leaf.
You know that smooth gray bark people carve their initials into? That tree is one of the most important wild food trees in North America. The beech drops small, three-sided nuts called beech nuts, rich and a little buttery, and for thousands of years they fed native peoples and nearly every animal in the forest. But now for the wild part. The passenger pigeon once numbered in the billions, flying in flocks so massive they darkened the sky for days, and it lived mostly on beech nuts and acorns. Those flocks chased the beech crop clear across the country. Then settlers cut the forests and shot the pigeons by the trainload. The whole thing fell apart.
And the eruption of wings, it was so loud that these men with guns were terrified. There were tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of passenger pigeons.
And we lost it. From billions to none in a matter of a few decades.
And on September 1st, 1914, the very last passenger pigeon died alone in a Cincinnati zoo. The beech outlived the bird it used to feed. And it's still fighting, because a new thing called beech leaf disease started killing these trees in Ohio back in 2012. Grow one of these, and you've got a living scrap of a forest that's basically gone now. Still, the tree coming up hides a secret almost nobody would believe. Somebody was farming it 7,000 years ago. Things get strange at number 9, the American hazelnut. You probably think hazelnuts come from Oregon farms or a jar of chocolate spread. But two wild kinds, the American and the beaked hazelnut, grow across huge chunks of the country, and they hand you sweet little nuts off a bushy tree in just 2 or 3 years, way faster than most nut trees. The hidden story, though, is the wild one. In 2024, a DNA study found that indigenous people in British Columbia weren't just gathering beaked hazelnuts. They were growing them on purpose, hauling the trees almost 800 kilometers across the land and replanting them, going back more than 7,000 years. Tribes like the Karuk and Yurok also burned the ground around them, because a low fire makes hazelnuts throw out more nuts and straighter stems. That's not foraging, that's farming. Thousands of years before anybody gave it that name. Get a couple going and you'll have a fast, steady harvest off a bush people have used for food and tools forever. But what's next is secretly holding up a huge global industry, and you've eaten its work 100 times without ever knowing. This next one's sneaky, number 8. The California black walnut. Almost nobody plants this one on purpose, yet it props up nearly every walnut orchard on the planet. The Northern California black walnut, called Juglans hinzesi, only grows wild in a small slice of California, and before 1850, just 3 or 4 wild patches were known. Then growers noticed something strange. The English walnuts you buy kept dying from a disease in the soil, but this tough California native just shrugged that same disease off. So in 1893, the famous plant breeder Luther Burbank crossed the two and made a super tough root he called Paradox. Today, almost every walnut tree grown for sale on Earth is English walnut up top, joined onto California black walnut roots underneath. Just about every handful of walnuts you've ever eaten grew on the roots of this native tree. Its dark, swirling wood, called claro walnut, gets carved into guitars and gun stocks too. Put the pure native in the ground and you get nuts, beautiful wood, and a piece of living history. And its close cousin, another native walnut, is quietly dying off right now, with barely anyone watching. Number 7 is the butternut. Also called the white walnut, the butternut hands you a sweet, oily nut that tastes milder and richer than its black walnut cousin. Native peoples boiled the nuts down for their buttery oil, and pioneers used the husks to make a yellow-brown dye. And that dye actually showed up in a war, because Confederate soldiers used butternut and walnut hulls to dye their uniforms a muddy brown, which is how some got stuck with the nickname butternuts. But this tree is in serious trouble. A fungus called butternut canker first turned up in Wisconsin in 1967 and started strangling the trees from the inside. In some states, it has killed off around 80% of them, and in Wisconsin alone, over 90% of the living butternuts are already sick. Whole patches are simply gone, and Canada now calls it endangered. The one bit of hope is that a few survivor trees carry natural resistance, so people are racing to breed from them. Nurse a resistant butternut along, and you're not just feeding yourself, you're helping rescue a tree that's slipping away. But the one coming up didn't just feed people. It was the main food for entire nations. Time for number 6, the mighty oak. We walk past oak trees every day and never think of them as food. That would have stunned just about anyone in old California. Across the middle and southern parts of the state, the acorn was the #1 food, the single most important plant in their diet. And by most accounts, more than 3 out of 4 people ate it every day. The catch is that raw acorns are bitter and a little bit poisonous, full of stuff called tannins. So tribes like the Pomo and the Miwok cracked them, ground them into meal, and rinsed the tannins out with water until the flour turned sweet and safe. Then cooked it into mush and bread. They even lit small fires under the oaks to grow bigger, cleaner crops. That meal is no joke either, packing around 7 grams of protein and 14 grams of fat in every handful. And a white oak can live 500 to 600 years, dropping food the whole time. One white oak in your yard is a food machine that outlives your great-grandkids. However, the tree after this one refuses to share its dirt with anybody. Coming in at number 5, the black walnut. The eastern black walnut is so prized that its Latin name, juglans, basically means nut of the gods.
These little green fruit are black walnuts. They're all over here in North America, especially here on the East Coast, and they taste magnificent. They have much more flavor than the store-bought walnuts, which are generally English walnuts.
The nuts have a bold, almost wine-like flavor you'll never get from a store-bought walnut. And the dark wood inside is some of the most valuable timber in America. But this tree plays dirty. Its roots, leaves, and husks leak a chemical called juglone that poisons a lot of plants nearby, things like tomatoes, apples, and blueberries, in a ring that can reach 60 to 80 feet from the trunk. People watched it kill their crops almost 2,000 years ago, and chemists finally caught the culprit back in 1856. That same husk makes a brown-black dye and ink so stubborn that native peoples and settlers used it for hundreds of years, and it'll stain your hands for a week. The nut sits behind one of the hardest shells of any nut on the planet, the toll you pay to get in. Keep one well away from your garden and it pays you back in amazing nuts, top-shelf wood, and free ink. But the next one mattered so much that chopping down its groves helped start a real war. Rolling into number 4, the pinyon pine. A pine tree is probably the last place you'd look for a top-tier nut. But the pinyon pine of the American West is exactly where real pine nuts come from. And for more than 10,000 years, they were the heart of life across the Great Basin for the Paiute, Shoshone, and Washoe peoples. Families came back to the same groves every fall, knocked the cones loose, and stored the rich pine nuts to get through winter. The nut mattered so much that entire creation stories grew up around it. Then the trouble started. When the Comstock Silver Rush blew up in 1859, miners poured in and cut down huge stretches of pinyon groves for firewood and timber, ripping out a food source native families needed to survive. That, plus stolen water and land, helped push everybody into the Paiute War of 1860. A nut tree was that important. Get a pinyon started, and if you're patient, you'll crack pine nuts worth more per pound than almost anything on a store shelf. And what's coming did something no other tree here can pull off. It put a word in your mouth. Up next, number 3, the shagbark hickory. You'd know it by the bark, which peels off in long, shaggy strips like the tree's shedding its skin. And the nut inside might be the sweetest wild nut you'll find anywhere, with a taste people compare to sharp maple syrup. The Cherokee built an entire dish around it called canuchi, where you pound the nuts, shell and all, into oily balls and then simmer them into a thick nut soup. It's a recipe that goes back thousands of years. But the wildest part is sitting in your own mouth. The word hickory comes straight from the old Algonquian word pacohikara, the name for that pounded nut milk. Every time you say hickory, you're speaking a native word for this exact nut. The wood is so tough, they nicknamed Andrew Jackson Old Hickory after it, and the tree can live well past 350 years. Drop one in the ground, and you're leaving behind something that outlasts a dozen presidents. But this next one's technically a hickory too, and it's the only major nut that's truly native to all of North America. Then comes number 2, the pecan. Of every tree nut sold in the world, the pecan is the only major one native to North America, not shipped in, not borrowed from somewhere else. Even its name comes from an old Algonquian word, pecan, meaning a nut so tough you need a stone to crack it. Native peoples ate them for at least 8,000 years, and Thomas Jefferson loved them so much he carried them to George Washington, who planted them at Mount Vernon. But the modern pecan only exists because of one man almost nobody names. In 1846, on a Louisiana plantation called Oak Alley, an enslaved gardener known only as Antoine figured out how to graft pecan trees, joining a twig from one great tree onto another tree's roots so it grows the exact same nuts. Experts had failed at that for years. He got it working on 16 trees first, then over 100 more, and that's the reason every thin-shelled pecan you eat today exists. His pecan even got shown off at the 1876 World's Fair and named Centennial. An enslaved man built a whole American industry with a grafting knife, and most people have never heard his name. But number 1 was the real king of the forest, 4 billion strong, until we watched it die. And finally, number 1, the American chestnut. Once, this was the most important tree in the eastern United States. So huge and so common, they called it the redwood of the East. Almost 4 billion American chestnuts filled the forests. There's an old saying that a squirrel could cross from Maine to Georgia through chestnut branches without ever touching the ground. That's probably a tall tale, but the real number is staggering anyway, because in parts of Appalachia, roughly 1 in 4 trees was a chestnut. The nuts dropped by the ton every fall, fed people, fattened hogs, and held whole mountain towns together.
So why should you eat chestnuts? Chestnuts are low in calories, and they're very low carb food, high in protein. They're from the beech tree family. Chestnuts are loaded with magnesium and potassium. They help lower your blood sugar. They're good for your digestion.
The Cherokee ground them into bread and treated sickness with the leaves. Then it all ended. In 1904, a forester named Herman Merkel spotted a strange fungus on the chestnuts at the Bronx Zoo. And over the next 40 years, that blight killed almost every American chestnut alive. One of the worst disasters in the history of American forests. The giant became a ghost. But the twist is still going on right now. For years, scientists tried to build a blight-proof chestnut called Darling 58, hyped as the thing that would save the species. Then, in December 2023, the main group behind it dropped its support after the trees grew badly and kept dying. The fight to save the king is still on, this time by carefully breeding the survivors. Plant a blight-resistant American chestnut today, and you're not just growing nuts, you're trying to bring a giant back from the dead. Look at the pattern. Every tree here fed people or animals for thousands of years, long before any store existed. Some are vanishing, some are clawing back, and almost all will outlive whoever plants them. You plant it once, your grandkids eat off it. Hit subscribe, and we'll keep digging up what got buried.